Hey guys, so in this video, we're going to talk about air masses and then we're going to discuss fronts in the next video. So, what are air masses? Air masses are large bodies of air. They form when air is over a large region and it sits in that one place for many, many days. And then gradually it takes on the characteristics of the land. So, how do air masses affect our weather? As an air mass moves, it brings its characteristics with it and it changes the weather. So, to describe air masses, we use two characteristics, one for moisture and one for temperature. For instance, a continental Arctic air mass is cold and dry. Dry for moisture, temperature is cold. A continental polar air mass is cold, temperature, dry, moisture. Maritime polar air mass is cool, temperature, and um, moisture. Fine. And also, maritime tropical is warm, temperature, and moisture. Okay, so these are just some examples. So, what are the types of air masses? Air masses are described by their moisture and temperature. So, to describe the moisture of an air mass, we can describe an air mass in two ways. Either it's a maritime air mass, meaning it's moist or humid, and it forms over water. So if you see an air mass over water like these, they are maritime. Think marine, related to water. Okay. Now, if an air mass is continental, think continent, then it happens over land. It occurs over land and it's very dry. So remember the two moisture characteristics. Air masses can either be maritime over water, very humid, very moist, or continental over land, very dry. Now, to describe an air mass with temperature, we use three characteristics. An air mass can be Arctic. Arctic air masses are usually near the poles, North Pole or South Pole, and they are very, very extremely cold. Air masses can be polar. Polar air masses are cool to cold, not as cold as the poles, but still cold, kind of like Canada, northern Canada, or Alaska, and so on. Now, tropical air masses are warm or hot. These air masses are normally found near the equator. Okay, so Arctic, near the poles, polar, pretty cold, not quite near the poles, but still pretty cold, closer to the poles, and then tropical, more near the equator. So the written format for an air mass is this. First, you write the moisture, you abbreviate it, and then the temperature. For instance, if I wanted to write an air mass for maritime tropical air mass, remember maritime occurs in the water, tropical is near the equator, so it's warm and humid. We write it like this: M maritime in lowercase, and then T capital case for sorry uppercase for tropical. But you don't really have to memorize this because it's actually in your reference table. So if you go to page 13 of your reference table, in the bottom, you'll find this. It gives you all the symbols for the different types of air masses. So if you ever forget, you can just refer back to it. CA stands for continental Arctic, CP continental polar, CT continental tropical, MT maritime tropical, and MP maritime polar. Remember, the first letter is lowercase, the second letter is uppercase. You may be asked to write these abbreviations down, so make sure you refer to your reference table whenever you need to. Now, this is the world map, and these are all the different types of air masses. Notice that the ones near completely at the equator are maritime equatorial, meaning it's over water and it's at the equator. And then closer to the equator is maritime M, tropical. It's pretty tropical, pretty warm, not quite at the equator, very close to the equator, and maritime means it's over water. Notice that CT is continental tropical. These player areas are still close to the equator, but they're not on water, they're on land, so they're continental but also tropical. You'll find these areas, which is CP plus CA, meaning continental polar and continental Arctic, right? So places like Canada and Alaska are continental polar. They're not quite exactly at the poles, but they're pretty cold. But continental Arctic areas, kind of like these, very close to the poles, are extremely cold. Okay. So here, normally in Earth science, we focus on the continent of North America. And as you can see, there are a couple air masses that we need to remember. The first one, on top over here, it's basically this area right here. This is a continental Arctic air mass. It's very cold and dry. It's very, very close to the poles. When we go to Canada, which is somewhere a little lower right here, we get continental polar air masses and also Alaska. These areas are pretty cold still, not as cold as the North and South Pole, and they're very dry. Next to these areas, we get in the water areas, we have maritime polar air masses. Maritime because they're on water, polar because they're still quite near the poles, but not quite like very close to the poles. And then if you go more towards Mexico right here, these areas are more tropical areas. We're getting closer to the equator, kind of like in this area. And you'll see that if it's in the water, we have maritime tropical air masses. They're pretty warm, they're humid or moist. And then if you're on land, kind of like in Mexico, then this area would be continental tropical. Continental because it's on land, and tropical because it's pretty warm. It's near the equator. These areas are hot and dry. In earth science, on the regions, we normally focus on Mexico, Alaska, and Canada, and especially Alaska and Canada. The reason is a continental air mass can form over the land in places like Alaska and Canada that we established, right? But what happens is these air masses can sometimes move southwards towards the United States. This area is the United States. And since it moves southwards, it can affect our weather and make it cold and dry. When it happens in the wintertime, it feels very, very cold. And when it happens in the summertime, it feels really nice. So remember, Alaska and Canada, sometimes the wind from there, the continental polar air mass, does move because of planetary wind belts, which we'll talk about in the future, and it affects our weather, especially in New York. Also, another thing that also comes up is the Gulf of Mexico, which is right next to Mexico, but this is more on the water, and that's why the Gulf of Mexico is a maritime tropical air mass. Mexico itself is a continental tropical air mass. If you need to write these notes down in your notebook, I encourage it. So go ahead and pause this video. Try number 1. Base your answers to the question on the map of Australia below and on your knowledge of Earth science. Points A through E on the map represent locations on the Earth's surface that have different climates. Write the 2-letter air mass symbol used to identify an air mass that originated over location C. So the correct answer is continental tropical, CT. Why? Because continental because it's on land, and tropical because Australia is actually closer to the equator than the poles. So Australia is right here, right? Australia is continental tropical because it's pretty close to the equator, not quite close to the poles. So Australia is pretty dry and warm. So remember, you write the abbreviation like this, CT, not TC. That will matter. If you forget this, go back to your reference table, page 13. Go ahead and pause this video, try number 2. Which statement best describes the difference in air temperature and humidity between the CP and MT air masses? The correct answer is A. The empty air mass is warmer and more humid. Remember, MT stands for maritime tropical. Maritime means moist or over water, so it's more humid, and tropical means it's warm. So MT is warmer and more humid. CP is continental, right? So continental is dry, and polar is cool. Go ahead and pause this video, try number 3. Base your answers to the following questions on the weather map below. The map shows the center of a low pressure system. The location for Albany, New York is shown. Write the standard 2-letter air mass symbol to identify the air mass that normally forms over the Gulf of Mexico. The correct answer is MT, maritime tropical, right here. We know Gulf of Mexico is on water and it's tropical because it's near the equator. And this hint also helps. It's in 25 degrees north, very close to the equator. Now, you can also go to your reference table page 2 and 3, I believe, to figure out where the locations of different countries are and different continents are. And their latitudes and longitudes, and that will help you figure out how close to the equator those places are and how far. So go ahead and pause this video, try number 4. Circle the terms that best describe the relative moisture and relative temperature characteristics of the empty air mass compared to the CP air mass shown on the map. Well, we don't have a map, but let's figure it out just based on the symbols. Relative moisture of empty air mass. Empty, remember, is maritime tropical. Maritime tropical air masses are more humid, and the temperatures of maritime tropical air masses are warmer because tropical air masses are warmer. In the next video, we'll talk about fronts.